Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Welcome to the Imaginaries podcast, a podcast in which we discuss imaginary things and sometimes less imaginary things.
True.
Today
True.
we are going to discuss television shows with which we have fraught relationships.
Oh, yes.
Meaning that we watched a couple episodes and then we're completely turned off and or completely forgot about the show for a couple of years and then we're like, oh my god, this is in my Netflix queue again.
Yep.
Only you never erased it because you forgot it existed. So we're going to talk about some of those shows today.
Yes.
And I am here, I'm Kendra, and I'm here with Tony.
Yep.
And Tony is great.
Oh, thanks. You're great. You're great.
Did you want to talk about the first show?
Yeah, so what we're going to do today, we've selected 7 shows that are from, I want to say all of these are last 10 years, right?
Definitely. If not, like the last 5?
I want to say 1 or 2 might be older than 5. But what we're going to do is go through these 7 shows and try and use them to piece together something about what works, at least for us, about pilots, first episodes, the beginnings of shows, like what we're really looking for when we want to try something new, what hooks us in, and in the case of these 7 shows, what really didn't. And even if they may have been, well, I will say, none of these shows are shows that either of us got into later, so...
And I would also note that these are shows that a lot of people got into later.
Yes.
So they are, for us, a rich conversation point because we exist in tension with quite a few other people on what's foundational to good science fiction television.
Yes.
And each of these shows embodies something new in the world of television. We're going to talk about that in detail as we go along. The first show we're going to look at is...
Extant, the Halle Berry show. And before we jump into that, what I want to say, one last thing I want to say is that we're not trying to fight you about whether these shows are good or not.
I mean, I am.
Well,
Tony's not.
Kendra is. I'm not. I'm converse averse.
I'm
conflict averse. Hashtag Converse averse.
He also does actually wear Converse.
I do not wear Converse. That is a filthy lie.
Boat shoes. You definitely wear boat shoes.
I do wear boat shoes.
Okay.
But what we're trying to do here is really start a conversation. So you could easily have this conversation if Firefly didn't work for you, or Babylon 5 didn't work for you, or any of the shows which we like that maybe you think the pilot didn't really capture your attention for whatever reasons. What we're trying to do here is talk about what may not work for pilots, generally speaking.
Yeah, and maybe what makes for something sustainable. Because while some of these shows have seen second seasons and continuation, most of them have really struggled for one reason or another.
Yes, that's
true. And, we're going to talk a little bit about that, too. So, yes.
Yeah, alright, so let's go back to Extant.
Oh my God.
Like I said, the Halle Berry show.
The Halle Berry alien pregnancy flick.
Yes. So the first thing that I want to say is that casting Halle Berry and getting Halle Berry to carry a show like this was awesome and genius. And I wish that it would have been a better show.
And
because
she is sexy as hell. I mean, she is a beautiful human being. If you're going to pick a beautiful human being to be the center point of your show, awesome.
Yeah, right. I wish that it would have been a better show for Halle Berry, because I would love to see Halle Berry in a wonderful science fiction show.
Oh, yes.
Extant was not it.
I mean, and let's it bears mentioning, both of us really loved Cloud Atlas. That's a science fiction show in which she was allowed to shine because it was written better.
Yes.
So what was like the primary stumble for you of Extant?
The primary stumble for me in Extant was that it felt like someone had taken a very short list from Wikipedia, and this list had a title like, really tired things we are sick to death of seeing in science fiction. Decided that list actually said, things we really want to see more of in science fiction, and crammed them all into a script that had no nuance to it, had no interesting stuff to say about any of those, any of the items on that tired list, and then made it as though this was something that people were just going to beat up.
Oh man, and it's such a shame because it's pretty star-studded. It's got a great cast. Halle Berry, I know Piers Gagnon, or I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but I know him. And Jeffrey Dean Morgan is a big name. Mm-hmm. All of these actors are well known. They're good actors. They're just put in a position where they have no good material. Yeah. And I think for me, I really struggled with one specific trope.
Pregnancy.
Alien pregnancy as a threat to a female's life, to the world's security. Yep. I mean, we have enough trouble with, women feeling alienated from their own bodies. Yeah. Hardy har har. And all of these other things that are the natural byproduct of being a woman in a culture where your body is not under your own control. And so the alien pregnancy trope has actually been studied probably to death at this point, as kind of symptomatic of women living in a patriarchal society in which they don't have control of their bodies and in which men feel like the female body is the ultimate threat, right? Like the female body unfettered is a real threat. So it's painful to me to see Halle Berry acting this out. Yeah. Because she, as a beautiful woman in Hollywood, a beautiful woman of color in Hollywood, has already been subject to so many of these tropes and of the general restrictions that society places upon women.
Yes, yes. The other thing that I want to note here is that, for the most part, when I use the word tropes, and I don't want to speak for you, because please tell me how you feel about this, but when I use the word tropes, and I don't know that I have during this podcast, I generally mean something that I recognize in other works, but it is generally a positive thing. Mm-hmm. Like, I want to see this in multiple ways, even if it's something I don't agree with. It's something that we can celebrate because it's part of the cultural consciousness. And I think the way that you're using it here is not that. Is that...
No, not necessarily. I guess I'm using it in the very literal sense that this is like an image or a plot construct that we have seen before in literature of some kind. And there's a lot of other, I call them relics of this sci-fi universe in which we are both very well versed. Yeah. You have the threatening, hostile corporation with nefarious interests. You have a brilliant Asian scientist working for this organization with nefarious interests, and he is himself unknowable and unreadable and probably evil. Yeah. And then, you have the alien monster thing that has psychic abilities that grows at an accelerated rate. You have, what's her husband's nationality?
Well, the actor is Croatian. I don't know about, I think.
Well, there's also there's the problem of having an Eastern European actor in an American Hollywood production where it creates a kind of unknowableness. Maybe he's okay, but maybe he is evil. And there's just all of these little relics of sci-fi literature that pop up again. And we've by and large moved past them and seeing them in our favorite works of science fiction because they've been there for so long and we're kind of sick of them. So that's more what I'm talking about when I'm talking about tropes, is things that we're sick of seeing. Yeah. They're not inherently problematic. Yeah. It's but the discussion of them needs to be there too. If Extant was to say, pregnancy thing, let's talk about this. Yeah. Then it would have been okay. But they didn't. They're we're just going to show the pregnancy the same way that we've shown it. Yep. Every other time. Yep. No one's going to talk about how apparently no one in this universe has ever watched a science fiction film.
Right. If anyone in Extant was even slightly familiar with any science fiction, they would not be in the Extant universe.
And I mean, it's just such a, I don't know, I have problems with this in part because it was executive produced by Steven Spielberg. He knows better. He really does. He's been doing this a long time. He created some of these tropes back in the 80s or even earlier. He's been around a really long time. Yep. And I think it's also a real failure of imagination on the part of CBS. CBS ordered this direct or straight to series is what they call it, which means that they didn't even do a normal pilot. So this was released, it was all produced at once or whatever, and then it was released episode by episode on Amazon Prime is how I discovered it. Yeah. But it was also, I think broadcast.
I think it was.
And it's a beautifully shot film. All of the soundstage bits are there. All of the computer animated bits are there. It's entirely a failure of imagination and characterization and like plot architecture.
Yes.
So
a failure of imagination is going to be a recurring theme throughout this episode of the podcast. I think we're going to come back to that idea again and again, that where a lot of these pilots or first episodes fail is that they're simply not imagining anything that we haven't imagined already. And not to say that what we're looking for, the mark of quality or the only way for something to succeed is showing us something new, because I don't think that's true at all. But it's saying something in an interesting or fresh way, or it's presenting us with a conversation that we've been having outside of television and want to bring into television, or it's reimagining. It's
just got to be goddamn interesting somehow,
you
know? Like, that's all we're asking is, like, one goddamn interesting thing from this series. And I think, Tony, I don't know how many episodes you watched. I stuck it out. I stuck it out to the end because I was tearing it apart on Tumblr. Back when I still used Tumblr, I was making these, like sort of commentaries on it. So I did actually finish the season, but it was exactly what was promised in the first episode. So the failure of the first episode was the same failure for the whole series, I suppose. And so it was canceled after 2 seasons. I haven't watched the second season at all. And that constitutes our first television series. But I know that you had our next series on this list.
Yeah, so I will preface this next series, which is Stargate Universe, by saying I am not familiar with the Stargate Universe. Not the show, but the franchise.
Larger universe.
I'm not familiar with the Stargate franchise.
I am.
Kendra is, so I will be deferring to her on some of these things, but really what I was looking for is, in the same way, because I am a Star Trek fan, and I think if you watched like any episodes of our podcast, or listen to any episodes of our podcast, you will know this. And what's great about Star Trek is that you can grab a series, and you don't necessarily need to have seen any Star Trek prior to picking up that series, or even that movie. I think you could probably go into the most recent movie even, and sort of have some cultural knowledge, like Kirk and Spock.
With the first one of the reboots. That's true.
But generally, Star Trek can be pretty friendly on a series-to-series basis. Like, not episode to episode necessarily, especially with Deep Space Nine. Right. Anyway, I'm getting way too far off of this. Always, I'm ready to talk about Star Trek. But I assumed that
Stargate... Deep Space Nine.
Yeah, definitely. But in Stargate Universe, I could get into it without knowing a whole lot about the Stargate franchise. And that was true for the most part. But really, where Stargate Universe failed for me is just that I didn't care about the characters it was creating.
Okay, so what happens in the first episode?
Fuck if I know. It's been a long time.
So like Stargates are these gates that basically create wormholes for you to travel between very distant planets from each other. And so the first Stargate is they discover the first Stargate buried under some sort of Egyptian monolith. And they bring it back to America, and they militarize it. And they start sending out groups of people to explore these other planets, and it becomes, what's fascinating, and what I think you would love about the original Stargate series, as cheesy as it is that it's anthropology. Yeah. So every culture that they visit on these planets was seeded from Earth, or an Earth-like planet, and it has developed to embody one of the different cultures at the different times or different places on Earth. So you have like a Mongolian culture from the 4th century or something, and then you have ancient Greek culture on another planet, and you have so they're going to these other planets, and they're engaging with essentially foreign cultures, either made foreign by time or ones that legitimately we wouldn't understand because we've never lived in ancient Mongolia, stuff like that. It's really fascinating, and it combines cheesy bad science with cheesy bad anthropology, and it's a rambunctious exploration narrative. But my understanding of Stargate Universe is that none of those things are true.
Well, the problem that I really had with it, and again, I can't speak to the larger franchise, but the problem that I really had with Stargate Universe is just that it seemed so all over the place.
This is the one that takes place on the ship?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and I was ready to jump into it for a couple of reasons. So I was, back when I was a kid, I watched reruns of Lost in Space, there was this show on Nickelodeon called Space Cases, in which you had a bunch of space cadets and a couple of teachers lost in space. The first Star Trek series I saw when I was a kid, my parents watched Next Generation, but when I was actually old enough to, say, I want to follow this Star Trek series, it was Voyager, which was Lost in Space. So I was ready to like it based on the fact that I had grown up with a lot of this Lost in Space television series kind of stuff around me.
Survivalist narratives, essentially, in space?
Totally. And it was disappointing on that front because it didn't really do a whole lot with that. It was disappointing character-wise because I don't remember what the character's name was or what the actor's name was, but the main character, the scientist character, just seemed so miscast to me. Like, he didn't really seem like a television actor. And
Isn't he in Once Upon a Time as Rumpelstiltskin?
I have no idea, actually. But I remember looking it up later and finding out that he was mostly a theater actor, which I guess
Dr. Nicholas Rush?
I don't know.
Robert Carlyle. It is the guy
that was
from
his name.
Once Upon a
Yes.
Time.
But otherwise, the cast was really interesting.
Oh, dude, he's from Sense8, the
right.
other guy.
Brian J. Smith is now on Sense8. David Blue, I thought, was good.
Ming-Na Wen from Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D.
Ming-Na has been one of my favorite actresses going back to when she was on ER, when she voiced Mulan, when she was in the Joy Luck Club.
Nice.
Like, we're going through a lot of things here. So it was a good cast. It was stacked with good people. It seemed like it didn't really know what it wanted to do with them. Like, I remember, I actually moved beyond the pilot for Stargate Universe, and it kept, like, switching back and forth as far as, like, if Ming-Na was a main character, if she was in this episode at all, if she was a guest star, like, what was going on. And that is emblematic for me of the way that this show was, like, really trying to juggle, like, what it was doing with its characters and who was going to be around and who was going to develop and who they were going to kill off 3 episodes in, and so I shouldn't get attached to. And so that sort of really unbalanced me in a way that was not at all pleasurable and didn't make me want to keep watching this show. And this is the only show on our list that I actually watched more than one episode of, but I lost it after the 4th or 5th episode just because I didn't have enough to grab onto. None of the characters really made me want to sit down and continue watching because I didn't care what happened to them. That ship could have exploded and that was fine.
Now, I know some people love Stargate Universe and were disappointed that it was canceled so soon into its run. However, I would say as a general observation, it was canceled for good reason in a sense. Like, it wasn't capturing the audience that it wanted to capture. And I think that's really regrettable because it does, the idea of being lost in space and in the context of the Stargate universe is novel. That could have been so interesting, and it was a reinvention of Stargate. We've gone through Stargate SG-1, we've gone through Stargate Atlantis. We were ready for the next good Stargate series, and this wasn't the one that caught people. And so it was trying to reinvent, this Sci-Fi Channel, mainliner show. And it didn't do it. And I actually think that makes for a great transition to our next show on this list, which is Killjoys. And to be honest, we could have probably discussed Dark Matter as well as Killjoys in this, but Killjoys makes for a great conversation tool between me and Tony because both of us have watched some of Killjoys. And I finished the first season. I tended to enjoy it simply because it was the main character kind of kicks butt, and she's a woman, and that's not all that common. But both Dark Matter and Killjoys are trying to bring spaceship science fiction back to the Sci-Fi Channel. And that makes them important flagship shows for our generation, because if we don't get another good shipboard show, then we might not get one for another decade, and that would be a real shame. You want to talk a little bit about your impressions of Killjoy?
Yeah, I'm not gonna be able to talk as coherently about this one because it was kind of a footnote in I was exploring some shows last summer, and I only ever watched the first episode of Killjoys. But what really stood out to me was just that it felt like it was trying to shock me in a lot of ways, and not in any important ways. And one of the major reason I wanted to get into it was that I had read that it was this really important show. Its primary character was a woman of color who kicked ass and wasn't apologetic about it, and was just a really cool character. And so I was prepared from the beginning to really like this show. And instead, and while I give that character her due, and like that, she's a really awesome character, and I don't want to take anything away from that, the world that she inhabited, the stories, the writing that provided that world, every other aspect of the show was consistently underwhelming.
And I think, okay, let's mention the elephant in the room again. Firefly. When we talk about these shipboard shows, one of the crucial components that has to be there for us to buy in is a larger universe, a larger world that is believable, fleshed out, and a lot of the places they visit in Killjoys have aesthetic comparisons or parallels to similar set pieces or scenes in Firefly, like the idea of a market that is distinctively like Asiatic in construct and populated by actual Asian extras, I believe, and that is pushed to a reductive extreme in this show, and I think part of it is budget, although I don't know if it can be because Firefly didn't have a big budget, so I don't know quite what wrong note it's striking, but in terms of the world that it builds, I just didn't buy it. It didn't feel fleshed out. It felt one note. It felt like, okay, this one planet has a market, and that's all that's going on this one planet. Then this other planet has a lot of aristocratic people fighting over bloodlines, and that's all that's happening on that planet.
Yeah. One thing that I would say as a uniting point between the three shows that we've talked about thus far, and perhaps will continue to be one as we talk about the next few, is that they seem formulaic. And that's a word that gets thrown around a lot, so I really want to talk about what I mean when I say formulaic. You're absolutely right to bring up Firefly with respect to Killjoys, because what's going on is it feels like a network or, I don't know, a series of producers or whatever. I don't know who is involved with this or who the ultimate blame would lay with, but it felt like someone said, all right, take what worked for Firefly and make it work again, because we want a successful show like that.
And what they ended up doing was taking Zoe Washburn and River Tam and fusing them into one person, and she's the lead character. Only, of course, she's sexually uninhibited and kicks butt all at once. So she's actually, I think, an interesting experiment in trying to see if we can make these characters we loved from Firefly into another thing. And actually several of the other plot components later on in the series that you missed out on resemble things from Firefly too. Like you've got genetic engineering and or training to create the ultimate human weapon. You know, you've got like the 2x2 hands of blue kind of feeling going on in this corporate world that's producing the assassin, ninja, princess, warrior person. I just think that that's really interesting, and that it just hit so many flat notes.
Yes.
So many flat notes.
And ultimately, I think what this is a return to the failure of imagination, because this formulaic approach is really saying, okay, let's take what worked in this show or this movie or this, whatever else they're drawing from, and let's make it work again, but it's not providing the boost of imagination necessary to really conceptualize what worked and to take the next step. It's trying to remake rather than take that next step. And I think that's an important loss for all three of the shows that we've talked about so far, and will continue to be the same sort of failure of imagination, failure of taking the next step in the next show we talk about, which is Gotham.
Oh my goodness. So this is going to create a lot of enemies for us, I think. I personally did not buy into Gotham, and I know it's gone on to a second season, and Jada Pinkett Smith is like an excellent bad person. Like that's all great. And actually, there's again like it's one of those shows where you want to say, I love this bit, I love this bit, I love this bit, but somehow altogether it just falls flat. And so I watched a grand total of 2 episodes of Gotham, and the only reason I watched another episode, the second episode, was because I was like, that can't be right. I love DC. I love DC way more than I love Marvel, and I managed to get through a season and a half of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. So what is wrong with me? That's what I thought. And I think I would like to affirm in all of our listeners that, you know, you like what you like, and you don't like what you don't like, and some of that comes down to a matter of taste. Mm-hmm. The reason why Gotham is on this list, and I'm not simply chalking my dislike of it up to personal taste, is that I have talked with several other fans of DC who are not able to buy into this series. So, Tony, I don't know if you watched anything.
I have not actually seen Gotham, so I'm checking out a little bit from this conversation at this point because I don't want to say anything about a series I've never watched.
Sure, but you've read some DC comics over the years. You understand that the stakes are pretty high when you're adapting beloved characters for either the big screen or the small screen. And we've seen so many tragic DC adaptations in the last couple of years. I mean, Catwoman, Batman. Not like the Batman series by Chris Nolan. I have a problematic but mostly love relationship with those three movies. But I think, the Batman versus Superman Dawn of Justice, it was just a shit show. Let's just say it. And everyone's really, really worried about Wonder Woman coming up. So, it's a great time to be talking about adaptations of DC versus adaptations of Marvel, and what's really going on here. And I have to say, as a person who hasn't read a lot of DC comics myself, who is knowledgeable about them because I was forced to work in the same cubicle as two dudes for an entire summer who were, and who talked nonstop about DC. I know a little bit about the world. I know the stakes are high. I know people love these characters. I'm understanding a little bit more about what makes the self-made heroes like Batman and Iron Man so appealing to us today as people who do not have superpowers ourselves, but who are in a state of continually reinventing technology and all that. I understand all that. I do not understand a show like Gotham, where you throw a bunch of characters into a pot. Some of them are played by good actors and some aren't. And you basically tell your watchers that it doesn't matter how this show is structured. It doesn't matter how these scenes are written. We trust that you're going to be here for us and that you're going to stick around simply because you're interested enough in seeing these plot arcs that you're familiar with play out on the big or small screen. And I think that we're at a point where we're kind of sick of that in DC. We've been failed so many times in seeing those plot arcs executed that we're just burnt out. We just want to see someone write a good movie or write a good series. And Gotham's writing is terrible. If you look at it objectively, there's no sense of pacing. There's no sense of coherence. And characters act completely contrary to, their central motivations often, simply so that the right events can happen in the right sequence. And when you are a slave to a particular arc from a particular series of comics, that is just going to be a tendency or a problem that you're going to have to deal with. So that for me was Gotham. And I think given our time constraints, we probably shouldn't talk about it at great length, especially since you're not familiar with it. But, if you're out there and you didn't like Gotham and you're wondering why, it's okay not to like a show about characters that you love that fails those characters so repeatedly. It's okay. Another better DC show will happen in the future. We just gotta cross our fingers and hope for it.
So it sounds sort of like, before we move on to the next one, it sounds to me sort of like one of your central problems with this is that essentially it disrespected its audience.
Well, it's assuming that all of its watchers are going to prioritize familiarity with a character over quality of actual production. Mm-hmm. And it's okay. So first of all, there's some good casting, and then there's some terrible casting. It's like they trusted that Jada Pinkett Smith and a couple of the other actors in this show were going to carry the emotional work. And you can't do that when you've got an enormous ensemble and so many characters on screen all at once. Yeah. And the kid who plays Bruce Wayne and the kid who plays his butler, they're just bad actors. I'm sorry. They're not able to perform the necessary acting to make their characters real in any way, shape, or form. And I'm not even talking about, like, doing justice to the, like, DC universe. I'm talking about acting. They're just not great actors. And so I don't know whether they ran out of budget to hire good actors or they just have terrible taste. That's, that's a matter for questioning later on. But I do want to transition to talking about the next show. Because this is interesting to me. This is something that's popped up in my Netflix queue a lot. It's like, if you liked Penny Dreadful, you might also like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. So do you want to talk a little bit about this show?
Yeah, so let me say that going in, I had sort of a complicated relationship with this media property. I will call it that, because both show and book. I read the book. And when I say I read the book, I mean I listened to it mostly as an audiobook because I had several long car trips. These car trips totaled about 857 hours because this book is like 300 pages, not 300 pages, 3,000 pages long. It was not actually 800 hours in the car. It just felt like
this was a book that used to be in like airport bookstores on prominent display for like years.
Yes. But before it sounds too much like I'm hating on this book, what I want to say is that I actually overall really enjoyed this book. I thought there was too much to it, like it was way overwritten, but its treatment of this alternate history where magic existed and where magic is really thoughtfully laid out in terms of how it exists, how it's practiced, how it's not practiced, how it's abused, how it exists in the world, as opposed to existing as a phenomenon in the universe. It is really cool, and I really liked it for that reason. And we may at some point do a podcast about this book, just because. Oh my
goodness, it's so massive.
I think it's worth talking about just that part of it. Maybe we'll do a podcast about different systems of magic in books and how they might work. But we won't go too far into that. What I do want to say about the television series is that this is another series where I watched only the pilot and then left it. And
this is a British show?
This is a British show.
BBC?
I cannot swear to that. I don't think it is. We're gonna double check on this. We're gonna fact check this whether or not this series was
we don't fact check many
the
things,
BBC.
But we will fact check this.
Yes, but where this show failed to me is just that the pilot was so goddamn boring. Like, I just did not want to continue watching the show afterwards. It was one of those shows where I watched that pilot and I was like, maybe I'll read the book again at some point. Maybe I'll go back and, like, read some Wikipedia articles or see what some folks online were writing about it, because I want to revisit that interesting concept of magic that the book has. But I don't really need to continue watching the show if it's going to move this slowly and do this little with the amount of time that I'm investing in it.
So it was a production of BBC One, and it was recognized by the British Film Institute as one of the top 10 most important television programs of 2015. And so it is technically a miniseries, not a fully fledged television show. And it's considered historical fantasy. So it is, in terms of like alternate history, alternate futurism, I think we need to talk about that separately sometime as well, because there are some really fascinating alternate histories out there. I, for one, love the Temeraire series, in which you have essentially Napoleonic era warships fighting with dragons. And so, like, there's a whole bunch of, like, really cool alternate histories out there, and we can discuss those as books and as film at some point. But, like, what turned you off this? It sounded like it was a pretty, like, immediate, like, no for you.
Yeah.
Was it the aesthetic?
I mean, I hate to sort of not be able to talk more about this, but and of course I can get more into why this was so, but really just that it was boring. Like, I did not want to continue to watch. And when we've talked about failure of imagination with these other series, we've meant it not directly as failure to make the audience engage with the imaginary product that we're seeing on screen, that we're being asked to actually invest our time and energy in. But in the case of this show, that's what it was. Like, I was just... It was putting me to sleep. It was, like, soporific. And I don't mean to... I was watching this at the same time that I was watching Downton Abbey for the first time. So, I mean, I don't want to...
For the first time?
For the first time.
So you've watched it more than one time?
I've watched it all the way through twice, yes.
Oh my god! I haven't even done that.
So, I don't want to hold this up as though... Or rather, when I started watching both of these shows, I expected the opposite result. Like, Downton Abbey was going to be a little more boring, but the show that, was also a period piece, but involved magic, was going to be really interesting and was really going to engage me.
Instead, the sexual transgressions of closeted people in British Isles.
I have to say, for me at least, if you're going to get me invested in a show, show me a gay character in the pilot, and I will be with you. And show me an interesting, good character.
Oh, yeah, very complicated character. Let's just say that, there's several characters of note in Downton Abbey that we haven't seen in television before, and it sounds like you didn't get any of that novelty in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell.
No.
So, okay, so I guess that's it. When you have a boring show, you have a boring show.
Yeah, and at some point we'll do lots of podcasts about Downton Abbey.
Oh my god.
Just kidding, we won't do that.
We won't,
not on this. This is not sci-fi.
Well, I mean, if we could, steampunk it up, wouldn't that be great? If we had, a steampunk Downton Abbey?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Let's make it happen.
Cool.
Okay, so... next show.
Yeah, so we have 2 more shows to go. They're both shows that Kendra is familiar with and I have heard of but have never seen.
Yeah, and these are both, for me, the quintessential watched one episode and then just was like, nope. So the first one, though, I think is a great one to transition to because Tony does have some familiarity with the source material.
A little bit.
That I do not. So... I'm talking about Shannara, the Shannara Chronicles, which were airing on MTV fairly recently. And in fact, they might have been renewed. So I don't know how much of this is like MTV trying something new and then just kind of being like, I don't know. I mean, I think we need cooler hair, people. I think we need to up the budget for cooler hair. And then, actually we don't have enough money for that really cool special effect you were going to do, Bob. So... sorry, it goes to hair. So, I don't know. Have you watched any MTV shows before?
I mean, in the 90s.
Some of the things that they've been doing lately are actually fairly inventive. I really enjoy Faking It. I really enjoy Awkward. These are both super low-budget shows that are, half-hour episodes about, girls in their teens doing weird things. So, Faking It is these 2 girls. They pretend to be queer at one point and they kiss and then one of them actually realizes she is gay and then the other one is totally straight and the lesbian one is in love with her best friend and so she's trying to navigate coming out while everyone thinks that they are already out but the other one actually isn't. It's super complicated but it works. It's beautifully written. It's very sensitive to matters of consent, matters of identity, in a very extraordinary way. Who would have thought, right? And then Awkward is just a girl navigating her own sexuality. I can't really make it more complicated than that. It's about it. That's it. There you go. But Shannara is an adaptation of a sci-fi fantasy-ish thing by... This is Terry Pratchett, right?
I actually did not read this.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so... But the larger world of Shannara is something that I have very limited exposure to. I read The Sword of Shannara recently, and it was just terrible. So I happen to believe that this is also a problem of source material not really challenging you to present anything new to your audience. I have heard speculation that Terry Brooks, sorry, not Terry Pratchett. Okay. I don't mean to malign Terry Pratchett. This is Terry Brooks.
Awesome.
Who is awesome.
By the way.
Yes. I don't mean to malign him. And I actually don't mean to malign Terry Brooks, because what I was going to say is that I've heard speculation that he became popular because he was one of the few people writing high fantasy at a time when readers had already just come back to consuming Lord of the Rings, and they were looking for other similar books, and there wasn't a whole lot out there except for Terry Brooks. So they consumed Terry Brooks, they fed him, he created more books, and it became a runaway smash hit blockbuster selling series that still people didn't really care about all that much. So now they've adapted it to a television series, also in a sort of situation where not many people care about it, really. They just want to see more fantasy on television, fantasy sci-fi. The reason why this hits our list of sci-fi is because it's set post-present Earth. So, like, our society a long time in the future, millennia in the future, has fallen apart and also things have gotten rather magical in the meantime.
Hashtag rather magical.
Rather magical in the meantime. And so it is sci-fi in the sense that we're talking about a future world, and it just happens to have kind of regressed in a lot of ways to resemble medieval culture, as fantasy worlds, high fantasy always seems to do. So in terms of failure of imagination, it's a failure both on Terry Brooks's part and on MTV's part to really see what's valuable about fantasy. We've got fantasy on television really working hard, like Game of Thrones. We don't personally like Game of Thrones, but it's doing a lot for the genre that's admirable, and it really cares about its aesthetic and its production value. Shannara doesn't seem to give a shit about production value, except to the extent of, like, does everyone look pretty? Are they in, like, designer clothes? Okay, we're good. So that's really all I have to say about Shannara. I was not interested because it seemed like a quintessential set of beautiful people stuck onto the same screen and required to interact with each other, however awkwardly.
Yep.
Unlike the show Awkward, which is highlighting awkwardness and the, like, complexity of awkward human encounters, this is just, like, bad acting because you're got, like, unexperienced actors doing these roles that require a lot of green time, and that's hard for anyone. So, that's Shannara. The last show on our list.
Yes.
You do have some familiarity with the premise, correct?
I do, I think. But I'm gonna throw this one over to you, because I only know a little bit about it. But Under the Dome.
Under the Dome. And actually, we could probably talk about several blockbuster television shows in the same breath, in that we have quite a few post-apocalyptic or, like, post-alien invasion shows.
Yeah.
What's the other one? Falling Skies?
Falling Skies, which could have very easily been on this list.
It could
because I watched one episode when it first came out because I was a huge Noah Wyle fan from ER.
Oh, that's the Noah Wyle show.
Yeah, but it was just...
I just know him as the librarian.
I just remember not liking it at all. And I haven't... It's been on for several seasons now, and I think it might have been canceled after, like, 6 seasons or something.
Yeah, a long time. It was surprisingly long. That one I don't think was necessarily... And actually, Under the Dome and Falling Skies and the one set in Defiance, you know, the one I'm talking about with, like, the St. Louis Arch? Okay, anyway. No. Our listeners are going to know what I'm talking about. A lot of these shows have gotten multiple seasons, but they're the kind of show that people watch out of habit, not because they seem all that attached to the characters, and I think they're relying on, like, the central mystery, either of the alien presence or the alien invasion or the mystery of this giant bubble that prevents us from communicating with the outside world to, like, drive the interest. But the problem is a transparent dome is not that interesting. And so the first episode relies on, and I don't know about Falling Skies, but the first episode of Under the Dome relies on the special effects to be, like, the big, like, whoa factor. Like, seeing a person or a cow cut in half because it happens to be under the dome when the dome comes down. And, like, all those, like, things that get cut, the roads that get divided, the cows, as I've mentioned, the houses, the very structures that get instantly blown into two parts. And I think that isn't enough, even for, like, the audience member who's there for, like, the special effects. I don't think it's enough because it's, like, 2 minutes of your show. Yeah. And then the rest of the first episode is trying to figure out, like, what's happened. And the audience already knows. The audience knows that a big damn dome has dropped over your town, or, like, aliens have invaded. And it's kind of like, okay, we want to get to the really important work, which is what people do in a closed environment. Like a survivalist story. We want to know about their relationships, and that isn't set up enough in the first episode of Under the Dome. I wouldn't know whether it's set up enough in Falling Skies or whatever.
What this is really sounding like to me, not to derail this conversation, but something that's actually very long-lived indeed, the X-Files. This is reminding me a lot of the X-Files reboot first episode. Because, again, it's something that... And, I mean, the X-Files struggled for years and years to deliver on the premise of, you know, resolving the mystery, that it was all going somewhere, that we would find out, you know, that we wanted to believe for a reason, because there was something there.
But we bought Mulder and Scully. Like, I think because we bought Mulder and Scully, we were willing to stick it out.
Yes.
And all of these shows we've talked about today have ensemble casts.
Yes.
Massive casts.
Yes. Yeah. Right. No, I just wanted to, I mean, but before you go to that excellent point, I just wanted to say the first episode of the X-Files reboot sounds like Under the Dome for that reason. Just that, like, you know, it's still trading on this central mystery, but is unable to, and for me, I only watched that first episode, which the internet has told me is not a good idea, and the episodes that followed, like, I think 2, 3, and 4 were actually better. But anyway, you know, just that there's, if you don't have, I mean, if the way you're trying to hook people in is a mystery that folks are not necessarily investing in and will continue to watch to see, oh, how is this resolved? What will happen? Is there a way? Do I trust that this is something that I will find out if I continue to watch this? Then you lost your audience.
Well, and like, you have to buy the dynamic between your central characters from the first episode.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about the second half of the first episode. I'm talking about the beginning of the first episode.
Yeah.
And if you're relying on the shininess of a spacecraft, or the special effects of a dome coming down, or like creepy alien baby or something to be your interest factor, you've lost us.
Yeah.
And you've lost a lot of an audience. And so if we're gonna like distill this episode down to like a kind of very messy conclusion, like, what do you think that we can learn from shitty first episodes or shows that are just shitty in general?
I really, and I know I've said this many times, but I think having hashed through these shows, the first episodes of these shows, I really think what it comes back to is a failure of imagination. And I don't think that that's something objective either. And I still stand by what I said at the beginning, that, you know, if you're a fan of these shows and continue to watch them and really like them, you know, we'd like to hear from you in comments and responses and ongoing conversations about what really kept you watching and, you know, whether things got better, and presumably they did if you're fans of the shows. But for me, at least, what misfired in these and other examples is just that what I expected and what I saw, or what I was promised and what I saw, or what I was given to feel my imagination and what was actually produced on screen, were not the same thing. They were off balance. They were not equivalent. They were presented to me as though I should like what I was seeing, but it missed some vital components, or it traded too heavily on some components that were not strong enough. Maybe it was a show that relied too heavily on its visual effects at the expense of story and character and cinematography, or something like that. And I can't point to any one of these and say, this is exactly why all of these failed.
Well, it's never that simple.
It's never that simple, of course. But
we would love to hear from you. Like,
yes.
We realize that sitting in a room or in multiple rooms across the country talking about these things on a mic doesn't represent all aspects of a situation or a text. And so we'd love to hear from you. You can get in touch with us online through our website, or, of course, in the comments section on iTunes and SoundCloud. So please, look us up, dig up our information. We're easy to find, and get your questions or your comments or your feedback out there, and we'll do our best to respond to you in that. What do we have coming up in future weeks?
Oh, that's a good question. We have, as yet to be determined podcasts.
We have a lot of ideas, so
we
if you have requests, please feel free to voice those. I know I for sure want to talk about the Southern Reach trilogy.
Yes.
By Jeff Vandermeer. I would love to talk about Ian Banks and culture.
We are definitely going to talk about Octavia Butler coming up soon. I actually just read Luna New Moon, which we did a podcast on already. I have a few books that are on my shelf. I'm about 50 pages into Ancillary Justice by Anne Leckie, which we will also no doubt talk about at some point in the future. But anyway, the bottom line is, I think, and all of these are books, obviously, and we'll talk more about more movies, more TV shows.
We're going to try to mix up, like, current releases with, like, a little bit older, sort of mainstream stuff.
Yes. And we'd like to, as well, not just base all of our podcasts around a book or, you know, an episode of a show or a movie or something like that. We'd like to talk
about some of the deeper issues underlying sci-fi.
For sure.
And we're going to talk about hard science at some point in science fiction. We're going to talk about space fantasy or science fantasy.
I dearly want to talk about science fantasy, so we will do that.
We'll do that. We'll talk about humor. We're going to talk about all sorts of wonderful things.
Yes.
So because we have such a long list of things that we want to talk about, including The Expanse, and I'm just going to start Indrapana Das's The Devourers, which is a recent release in sort of science fiction fantasy.
We definitely want to talk about Sense8 as well.
We were going to talk about Sense8 because we've got season 2 coming up, man. It's so exciting. So there's so much out there. We need you to help us prioritize. So what you would like to hear us talk about?
Please let us know.
Please let us know. And we will catch you on the other side. Have a good evening. Or day or morning or whatever it is.
Whatever time of day.
Whatever time of day you're listening to this podcast. I'm going to shut up now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.